Hey, welcome, my wonderful students. This is your friendly neighborhood English teacher, Mr. Weaver, and hey, today we're going to go over, kind of review and discuss the concept of magic realism and Latin American culture, especially as it pertains to the story A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings that you will be reading at some point here shortly. So, look, in order to begin, if we're going to talk about magic realism, maybe we won't talk about this in terms of writing, but instead, let's take a look at this in terms of, if you will, a work of art. So, look, this is a piece that many of you have probably seen before. This is The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali, as it says there at the bottom. And here's the interesting thing about this piece, and again, I don't claim to be an art critic, but if you take a look at this piece, there are some things in this picture that should make sense to you. I mean, if you think about it, some things there seem very logical. For instance, the water in the background, it looks like there's some sort of maybe a seashore or a shoreline that's there. The cliffs that kind of lead down to the water in the upper corner there, they seem to make sense. I mean, I think I've seen things that look sort of like that. And then there's things like the tree that's there. I mean, that tree itself looks like it's not alive, but it looks like something that you could perhaps see in nature. That makes sense. At the same time, you'll note there's a whole bunch of things in this picture that don't seem to make sense. For instance, I just mentioned the tree, and the tree itself looks like something you could see, but it's growing out of something that appears to be man-made based on the really sharp edges there. I don't know what that is. Is it the corner of a desk or something? But we all recognize that that's not a structure that we would naturally see in nature. The lines are too clean for that. It doesn't make sense that there would be a tree growing out of a man-made structure any more than it makes sense that there's a bunch of melting clocks that are kind of laying around. My guess is you would not see clocks like that out in the real world. So, I have to mention certainly the part that's most nonsensical to me, and that is that kind of white blob in the middle that has a melting clock on it. I'll be honest, I don't know what that thing is. I've had students tell me in the past it looks like a melting seashell. I've had some people point out that there appears to be like a snake or a lizard head coming out of the bottom of it. Some people told me it looks like a horse to them. I don't know. I can never see that, but maybe some of you can. I always think it's odd that it looks like there's eyelashes sticking out of it there toward the middle. But the bottom line is, I have no idea what that is. So, if you understand these ideas, the fact that there are some things in this picture that seem to make a lot of sense, and there are some things that seem very nonsensical that don't seem to make sense, they seem almost magical or supernatural. If you understand those ideas, then you understand the concept, basically, of magic realism. You see, magic realism is essentially an artistic genre where magical elements and illogical scenarios appear in an otherwise very normal environment. So, if you think about it, we have a very normal environment with this picture. I mean, obviously, we have, as we mentioned, the background looks very, very normal. And yet there's some things in here that are very, abnormal, supernatural, magical. The melting clocks, as I said, the white blob in the middle, the fact that the tree is growing out of a man-made structure. Those things don't make sense. So if you take a look at this definition, it really fits that particular picture very well. And that picture is an example of magic realism from an artistic standpoint. Now, obviously, we're going to be talking about magic realism in more of a literary sense. So, look, when it comes to magic realism in the literary sense, there are a few characteristics of magic realism that exist, and I want to review those with you here quickly. So, the first characteristic of magic realism is this concept of hybridity, this blending of elements of reality and magic, or maybe a mixing of cultures, if you will, to construct this new, unique kind of creation. Now, you're going to see this in the story of Very Old Man with More Enormous Wings, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, excuse me. You'll notice that there are going to be some very magical elements. Obviously, as the story's title kind of suggests, there's going to be an old man with wings. In the context of the story, the townspeople don't know if he's an angel or if he's just some sort of kind of a mutant, if you will. They don't know, and that has a part to play in the story. You're also going to notice at one point in the story, there's a spider girl that walks into town, and certainly she is there for a very deliberate reason as well. But there's this blending of these very magical elements in what appears to be a somewhat normal setting as far as the town is described. By the way, I mentioned the Old Man with Wings and the Spider Girl. This is where the second point comes into play, this arthurial irony. In order for this kind of magical element to be fully played out, fully fleshed out in this story, the author does not over explain the magical element. So you're going to notice a difference between, for instance, the Old Man and the Spider Girl. The Old Man is not explained very much to us at all. We have no backstory. We have no idea where he comes from. We have no idea what he is. Again, some people think he's an angel. Some people think he's a mutant. Some people think he's simply an old man with wings. There's a mention in the story at one point that maybe he's an old Norwegian, even though there's nothing else that really suggests he would hail from Norway. So but he's not explained. We don't know from where he comes. You will notice where the Spider Girl is concerned, we do know where she comes from. Pay attention to that as you read the story, because that is one characteristic or one aspect of characterization that really differentiates the Old Man from the Spider Girl, and I think really helps to kind of tie into the thematic focus of the story as well. I'd like you to be looking for that, certainly as you read through this story. So those are the first two elements, but there are a couple of others. So I want to talk about the latter two here, and the next one is this idea of reticence, which is the ambiguity of time and space caused by a lack of clear opinions about the accuracy of events, the credibility of the worldviews expressed by the characters, and so on. So what exactly does that mean? It's a fairly lengthy definition. Well, if you notice, this story is very ambiguous with regards to its setting, its time period, and so on. I mean, we know very few things about the setting of this story. We know, for instance, that based on a few details, that the story is set somewhere near water. You're going to notice crabs. You're going to notice some of those kinds of things that suggest that maybe they're near water. It in some ways the story reads like something maybe that would have occurred a long time ago, and yet at one point there's an airplane that's mentioned in the story, just kind of in a matter of fact detail. So that suggests that maybe it's maybe it's a more recent time period than what maybe we think it is. The bottom line is we don't know, and that's really important when it comes to the thematic focus of the story, because you see, this is a story that, because we don't know exactly the time and the place where it takes place, it could take place perhaps at any time, anywhere, which is really important to the thematic focus. Again, think about that as you are reading this story, as you're processing this piece, as you're analyzing it, because I really think the reticence is pretty important to the story, and again, its thematic focus, what it's trying to convey. So, hey, the final idea then is this idea of the supernatural versus natural. Now, we already mentioned, the arthurial irony and certainly the other aspects of the story here, but this is a little bit different than what we talked about here in the previous slide. It's a little different than the hybridity, for instance, because that's the mixing of the elements. This deals with the way the characters in the story perceive those elements. The supernatural is not displayed as questionable. It's integrated into the norms of perception of the narrator, the characters in the fictional world. So, to give you an example, the Old Man with Wings, where they find him, and when Pelayo and Lucinda find him, the individuals in the story who have the angel, they don't necessarily freak out about it. I mean, they think he's unique. They think he's interesting. And ultimately, they use him for a purpose, which, is not necessarily moral. But that said, they don't treat him as you would expect people to treat a mutant, if you will. You'll notice later on in the story, the Spider Girl, when she walks in, if a Spider Girl walked into our classroom or walked into your house, you would probably scream and run away. They don't do that. In fact, they react in a very kind of surreal way, and they very much accept her for what she is. So it's kind of an interesting idea, this natural versus supernatural within the context of the story. So this kind of concludes our discussion of the magic realism, especially as it applies to A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. So I hope you enjoy the story, read it carefully, analyze it, and we'll pull back together shortly. Thank you, and carpe diem.